Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I am really excited for this morning's talk. I will start by acknowledging that I live and work on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish people. I am so excited to have Shiayli Toni here with us today. Shiayli is an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia. She's majoring in gender, race, sexuality, and social justice. Shiayli is currently a student staff member at the UBC Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office, where she's been a staff member for 2 years. Shiayli is also, was also a varsity hockey player with the UBC women's ice hockey team. And in her time with the hockey team, she organized 2 sexual assault awareness games on behalf of the women's hockey team, raising money for a local rape crisis center, and developed and delivered a consent culture workshop to the student leaders of the Thunderbird Athletic Council. Shiayli, I am so excited and so thankful to have you talking today. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, I am so grateful to be here. And thank you everyone for joining us. This is so exciting that we have this platform. And I always like to begin, before we get into the nitty-gritty stuff, just embodying a sense of gratitude, because the work we're talking about today, it means we have to show up with our whole hearts. So I just want you to get warmed up with me, embody some gratitude. And first of all, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to speak with you and for you choosing to spend this hour learning and growing with me and engaging in this dialogue. And Amy, I am so grateful for you as well. Like, just the whole process of witnessing you create and develop this workshop. So I actually had the privilege of being coached by Amy for this past year, in my last year as a varsity athlete. And she's definitely someone I look up to as a leader, as a role model, and I know a lot of other people feel the same way. And what was so inspiring and impactful for me watching her go through this process was watching her lead, and not lead without fear, but lead despite it. And just seeing how creating this series for us was such a project and labor of love, of courage, and vulnerability. And there's something so inspiring and humbling about someone showing up, feeling all the feelings, and doing it anyways. And I hope that embodying these values and this great role modeling we've received, we can bring that into our dialogue today and have an open heart. And I just want you to take some time to feel gratitude towards yourself, gratitude for showing up, being open to learning and challenging yourself, and see what you have that you can bring to this work. So now that we understand, we're grateful, we're excited to be here, I just want to do an acknowledgement. So similar to what Amy just did, I want to acknowledge the land we are on, and also acknowledge my positionality and my power and responsibility in being on this land, and what that means for the way I move into this work. So my name is Shiayli, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am of German and Taiwanese descent. And I was born on Plains Cree territory and the Métis Nation homeland, which is known as Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I live in Vancouver now, and I'm very happy about that. So today I'm speaking to you from Musqueam territory. And it's so important to center and acknowledge the land we are on and what this means about the colonial history of Canada and the present day reality of Canada, because what we are seeing today is that colonialism is embedded in the systems and structures we operate in. It is so normalized for us. And if we are not Indigenous and don't face this reality, this violence, this marginalization on a daily basis, it's easy for us to not recognize our power and our responsibility in changing that, and the way we show up and actually contribute to these systems. And this is so important for our talk today. We don't just do a land acknowledgement to check the box, pat ourselves on the back and say, like, I showed up today. I was a good ally. We do it because this conversation is so central to what we're talking about. When we look at the statistics, Indigenous women and girls and two-spirit individuals experience sexual violence at disproportionate rates compared to the rest of society. And when we're talking about the land and we're saying that it is unceded, what we mean is that it was stolen without consent. So this lends itself to the understanding that the way we learn to value and treat and regard people is going to have long-term outcomes. We are going to see it in how we end up treating them. The way we value them and center them in our culture, the way we regard them, ends up being the way we treat them. And so this is not just a problem related to colonial violence and sexual violence. We see this across the board. We see this in the current social justice and civil rights movement around anti-racism. And we have to understand that there are some people, like Black people, who experience inordinate amounts of violence. And so really centering and understanding that when we're talking about rape culture, when we're talking about consent culture, this is not a separate issue. It's not on the periphery of our lives. It intersects and is interwoven in our social reality and in our social norms. So hopefully by talking about this today, we have a greater understanding of how we are centered in it and what our responsibility is. And so then just moving forward into our talk, I'd like us to do some intention setting. So with everything going on today, the heightened conversations, your willingness to show up and have this dialogue with me, there can often be a lot of fear. How do we show up? How do we operate responsibly and ethically? And there can feel like there is this really high standard and almost unattainable standard for allyship. And I just want to let your shoulders relax a bit and have this understanding that we are not here to be perfect. None of us are perfect. We will never be perfect, and that's okay. We are here to be useful. And being useful shows up in so many ways, and we'll get into that today. And you'll start to understand how you as an individual, in your positionality, in your power, you have a specific usefulness because of your unique life experience, your unique identity, and your unique impact. So let's just move through this with open hearts, with gratitude, with that courage and vulnerability to really challenge ourselves and to learn and grow today. So I'm gonna do a quick screen share here so you can see my presentation. So today we're gonna be talking about championing consent culture. So today we're gonna be taking a strength-based approach. And what that means is I wanna recognize that whether you are fresh into this work and this is your first time on this topic, or whether you have a storied experience with sexual violence and anti-oppression work, we all have a unique perspective and unique experiences that we bring. And whatever your background is and however you came here, we all have different skills and capacities that we bring to this conversation. And people often ask me, Shiayli, why are you so interested in bringing consent culture and that dialogue into sports? And they're like, wait, I think I know. Is it because sports has a toxic masculine culture and, a lot of stuff happens there? And I'm like, yes, but no. This is across the board. Our issues with sexual violence, the way it has been normalized in our society, this happens in sports, but it does not just pertain to sports. And the reason I am so passionate about talking about this with athletes, with coaches, with administrators, is because me as a student athlete, I recognize that many of the talents, many of the capacities and skills we learn and embody in sports are so applicable to our daily lives and to other movements and to leadership. So I just want to give a quick overview to kind of ground your understanding in what you're already showing up with, what tools you already have. And then as we move through this presentation, we'll just start to build and expand on what you're already showing up with. So first of all, when you're in athletics, you understand the need to embrace discomfort. And we see this when you or your athletes show up for practice or workout. We understand that it takes a certain amount of physical discomfort to see growth, to pursue excellence. And we know that this is a normal and positive part of the process. And it goes the same mentally, you know, when we're working on new skills and strategies, when we're learning to be a student of the game, we understand that mentally it takes some effort and discomfort, and we embody that and we embrace it. So today I invite you to embrace whatever discomfort might come up for you and understand that this is part of the learning process and part of our journey. And then the second part is knowing and growing your role. As an athlete, you show up on a team and you have a specific role, whether you're a goaltender, a forward, a defenseman, whether you're an administrator, a coach, a support specialist, or support worker. And so it's really important to really hone in on what your role is and what you do really well, because we understand that as we embrace discomfort and continue learning, we really need to own what we're already good at. We already come with a set of tools and skills, and that is what translates into us being a really great asset to our team and to our organization. And today as we talk, I want you to embody growing your role. And we do this when we want more playing time, when we want to be on one of the specialty teams, when we want more responsibility and chance to perform and excel. And so already as athletes and people in sport, we embody this principle of knowing our role and then continually striving to grow it. And then third, honoring the process. So we know as athletes, there's never a mark you hit, a title you win, or a skill you develop where you can just sit back and be like, I did it all. Coach, I don't have to come to practice anymore. I don't have to work out. I've made it. You know, did LeBron stop after he won his first championship? No. We understand that there is no invisible finish line. And if we start to embody this knowledge when we talk about consent culture, when we talk about social justice, we understand that being an ally is a process. It's not a noun or title we hold or carry. It's a continual process of learning and of action. And it requires us showing up every day. And we don't get to stop. We keep leading by learning and growing. And we understand that this is a continual process, and we learn to embrace and honor this process. So these are the thoughts. We're going to get into our presentation now. So I first want to start off with some definitions, because I think it's incredibly important to fully understand the terms we're referring to, so that we have a shared understanding when we're talking about and elaborating on these terms. So when I'm describing sexual violence, that is really an umbrella term. So this constitutes sexual assault, misconduct, and harassment, but really it involves any unwanted sexual action or contact without another person's consent. And this also extends to targeting of someone's sexuality, their gender identity, or their gender expression, understanding that it's this removal of autonomy, this sense of objectification and dehumanization, and that sexual violence is an umbrella term for all the belief systems and actions that fall into this category. And so when I talk about sexual violence being so prevalent in our society, I'm referring to rape culture. And so what this is describing is broader social attitudes about gender, about sex and sexuality that normalize sexual violence and undermine equality. We understand that one of the foundational things that makes rape culture so prominent is everyday sexism. The notion that certain human beings, certain genders, certain races have less value than us, and therefore certain people feel entitled to enact power and domination over them. And so just understanding these definitions, I'd like to move forward really understanding the way and contextualizing the way these show up in our everyday life. So let's talk about the 3 levels of prevention. So there's the primary level, the secondary level, and the tertiary level. So primarily today, we're going to be focusing on the primary level because this is where we show up every day. And unfortunately, this talk isn't long enough that I can delve into all the other details. So in focusing on this, I think I can give you kind of a broad overview and understanding and really help you situate yourself in this work. So when we talk about primary prevention, it's often understood as bystander intervention, which is actually secondary prevention. So bystander intervention is when you witness violence occurring or about to occur, and you as the bystander are able to step in and deter that from occurring. And this is in the moment, it's immediate. So that's why people think it's primary prevention, but it's actually secondary prevention, because by the time we are in the position to witness violence occurring or about to occur, someone already felt the entitlement and the capability of starting to enact that. So this is our secondary prevention level. When we're talking about primary prevention, what we're talking about is everything before sexual violence occurs. So we're focusing on preventing incidences by promoting education, investing in structures and practices that support equality. And we're really talking about the social messaging that's out there and the norms we are creating and the kind of expectations we're setting around the way we regard people and value them and treat them. And then just quickly touching on the tertiary level of prevention. So this is after an incident has occurred, and it's the responsive measures we take. And this includes policies and protocols for supporting and connecting survivors to appropriate resources, to support, and it also means taking disciplinary action. And you may be wondering, okay, well, if something's happened already, how is our response actually preventative? And it is for a couple of reasons. First of all, in centering the survivor, in believing them, in having this really compassionate and supportive response, we are normalizing the idea that when this happens, we are going to believe the survivor. And when we believe them, it sets the norm that this is not okay. We are going to step up to the plate for you. And this actually deters future perpetration because it sends the message to other people that this is not normal. It is not okay. When we hold perpetrators accountable, we're sending the message that you are not going to get away with this, because something that people can get away from or get away with is something they feel emboldened to keep doing. So in the way we respond and show up to survivors, really center them with compassion and empathy and support, we are actually sending the social message about what is normal, what is expected, and what we stand for. And that really deters future perpetration. So our response is actually preventative. So today we're going to be focusing on the primary level of prevention. So talking about social messaging, talking about our norms, and what kind of climate we're creating in our everyday life. And the beauty of this is that secondary prevention and tertiary prevention are often situational. You need to be in the right place at the right time. You need to have the power and resources to be able to make these changes. But the thing with primary prevention is that we show up in this sphere every day of our lives. Just in our basic everyday social interactions, we are part of creating and maintaining these cultural norms and expectations. So moving forward, let's talk about some common social messaging regarding consent culture and sexual violence. So unfortunately, the vast majority of education around sexual violence and consent culture is targeted at survivors or potential survivors. And what we see is a lot of victim blaming statements saying, don't wear revealing clothing or walk alone at night. Don't drink too much. Don't leave your drink unattended. And what we're seeing is that the responsibility for safety is being put on the individual. And what is really problematic about this is not only are we diverting the accountability and the responsibility from the perpetrator of these harms, but we're also suggesting that if someone does experience harm or violence, that there was something they could have or should have done about it. And this means that survivors carry a lot of shame and guilt about what they did, what they didn't do, were they responsible enough? And this is not a narrative we want to buy into or promote. And so what we really need to do is start having messaging and education directed at people who might perpetrate, knowingly or not. We need to start sending the message not about don't get raped, but don't rape. And so just understanding that this is a huge gap in our education, let's kind of look at how rape culture shows up in our everyday lives, in our society, how it flourishes, and really center ourselves and understand what our power is and our influence is in changing that and starting to dismantle this system and this culture. So this model is what I refer to as the rape culture triangle. And so this really exemplifies for us the way different beliefs and actions build upon each other to create a culture where sexual violence is so common. And so as you can see, starting at the bottom, each layer and the actions and beliefs and attitudes embodied in that layer actually supports and enables the layers above it. So by looking at this model, we can clearly see the relationship and the connection between attitudes and actions that we deem as harmless and just dismiss, even though they're not harmless, and the way these are connected and tied to things that are more obviously harmful. And so just understanding this, it should feel very empowering for us because we can see how we are daily a part of creating, maintaining, or dismantling culture. And I just want to address another really common misconception about sexual violence. It's often that people think that there's a very small percentage of people who experience it, an even smaller percentage of people who perpetrate this violence. And then the vast majority of us who sit somewhere in the middle where we don't identify with either. And we feel like we are exempt from this discussion or this education. And I really want to drive home that we are all part of this and that we actually all show up on the triangle, whether we know it or not. And maybe that feels a little bit uncomfortable for you. I know it did for me when I first started thinking about this. But whether or not you personally identify or remember participating in some of the attitudes or actions on the very lower part of the triangle, we still show up there because we are in spaces and around people and in groups where this stuff does happen. And in those moments, we have a role to play. We can either challenge it and start saying like, hey, this isn't okay. This is not something we want to normalize. We can be silent and let it perpetuate by itself and be complicit in the way we are letting it occur around us. Or we can be perpetuating this because we don't have the understanding that some of these basic things that seem everyday and harmless are actually having long-term impacts. And so I just want to talk about the difference between intention and impact. We might not have malicious intention when we make a joke that is belittling women or transgender or queer folk, but it might have a larger impact down the road, some negative ramifications that we don't anticipate or are not aware of. So really understanding how our attitudes and actions are layered in society and really enable other harms to occur is a great way to hold ourselves accountable, but also be aware of our power in changing these things. And I want that to feel empowering to you. I want you to understand that you do have great influence, and we're going to talk about ways we can start utilizing this influence in positive ways. So I also want to talk about traditional gender scripts and kind of how this shows up in sports culture. So I started Googling some traditionally masculine attributes, what we perceive as masculine attributes, and then on the other side, what we perceive as feminine attributes. I want you to take a moment to look at these two lists. Now, they're actually very different and really polarizing. And it's hard to conceptualize how us as human beings could be so different. And I want to pose that this is not natural, and it's just the norm that we've created because of our social messaging, our cultural messaging, the ways we've socialized young men and women and people to regard their value in society and what is expected of them. And so what's really interesting is, as I was creating this slide, I went into the section of PowerPoint where you can add pictures from the web, and I looked up a man, and I inserted the first picture that popped up. And then I did the same. I looked up a woman, and I inserted the first picture that came up. Now, let's take a moment to look at the different pictures and representation. They're staggeringly different in the presentation, in what they're wearing, their facial expression, their body language, in how we are supposed to view and value them. So the man looks very professional, upper class, he looks intelligent, he's posed like he's about to have something to say. It's like we're looking at him with expectation, waiting for him to say something intelligent. When we look at the woman, she's alluring. She's waiting for us. Her presentation is very different. Is she wearing clothes? We don't know. And so what we start to see is the way these messages and these attributes and values start to be produced on a very visible, tangible, physical level for us. And this is messaging, whether we believe it or not, we are internalizing as we grow up in a culture that normalizes it. And it can be very uncomfortable to think, am I sexist? Am I embodying misogynist principles or expectations or standards? And I want to just level with you. We are all a little bit sexist because we grow up in a sexist culture. We're also all a little bit racist because we grow up in a racist culture. And this is not to say we are bad people. We are normal people because we are human beings and we learn what is around us. And so having this awareness and knowledge, it is really our job to start wrestling with some of these ideas that are maybe very subliminal, maybe not in our conscious awareness, and start understanding what this means for what we're perpetuating. And so just looking back at the attributes I've listed here, when we think of sports and the attributes and values that we really center in sports, which list does that show up on more? So the whole reason for having this platform in the first place is to elevate women's voices and experience and expertise in the sporting realm. We understand that sports are still very male dominant. And when we look at these attributes, we also realize that a lot of the things we value about sports culture and expect from our athletes are traditionally masculine traits. And so this kind of gives us an awareness and makes us pause a little to think about what messages we are creating when we're socializing and interacting with athletes. What kind of values and traits are we promoting and valuing? Which ones are we diminishing? And so moving forward, we want to have this awareness that these aren't necessarily just natural to sport, but they're in the very ways we think about gender and think about gender roles. So let's talk about language we use and the norms we set. So understanding that we have been socialized with these norms and values, let's look at some problematic language that pops up in sports culture. So don't be a pussy. What do we mean by that? this is really targeting and policing masculinity. And it's a masculinity that's grounded in these very narrow and rigid conceptualizations of what it means to be a man, what it means to be manly and assertive and confident. When we say man up, what do we mean by that? Are there better ways we can go around giving a message? Do we mean, I want you to dig deeper? I believe in you. I think you have more in you. Go harder, try harder. I want to point out that we don't use this language when we talk about women. We don't say, woman up. We say man up. We say, take it like a man. If I were to say, take it like a woman, whoa, now that has totally different connotations, right? And so this is what I call feminizing language. What we are doing when we are policing masculinity, when we are using this language and using feminized language, is we're sending these subliminal messages about what it means to be feminine. Don't be a pussy. So man starts to internalize and starts to marginalize those parts of himself that feel or are perceived as more feminine. What does that mean for the way he regards women and feminine identifying individuals? What does that mean for the way he regards and values those traits in another? And so also let's talk about diminishing language. When we pass something off as, oh, it's just locker room talk, or it's a joke, can't you take a joke? What we're doing is we're participating at the very bottom level of the rape culture triangle, where we're normalizing different language that is diminishing, that is harmful, normalizing that people have different value or that certain harmful behaviors and attitudes are okay. And this diminishing language does not bode well for what we're contributing to society and the messages we're sending people and having them internalize. So then the next part is just looking at what values, character, and behaviors do we normalize and should we normalize? What kind of things are we promoting when we're interacting with our athletes, with our organizations? And what are ways we interact and send these messages to discourage certain values and characteristics and behavior? What kind of language are we using to police each other's femininity or masculinity to say that some traits are okay and some aren't? And then what are we demonstrating in our own selves? It's one thing to say something to another person. It's another thing to demonstrate it. And I think for those of you who are parents, you'll understand this. You can tell your kids to do something all day or not do something all day, but really they're gonna model whatever you're showing to them. And it's the same when we show up in these spaces, and as an athlete, as a peer, as an administrator, or as a coach. And then also, what people, identities, and traits are we valuing? These are not all inherent things. Sometimes they show up physically with our gender, with our race. There's so many different identities and experiences, and how are we valuing those? How are we including this diversity? And how are we honoring that? Diversity is one thing. It gets diversity in the room, but inclusion and honoring that diversity is a whole nother thing. So when we go about our interactions, we have to be mindful of that as well. And then let's think of our spaces. What kind of spaces are we creating? Is this a safe space where men feel able to feel their emotions, to not always be upholding these very rigid norms of masculinity? Are we creating and maintaining spaces where women feel empowered to be assertive, to be bold, to be daring and brave? And what kind of spaces and culture are we actively dismantling? When we have this mindfulness and this awareness about how we show up and the impact and influence we have, we are not only building and creating culture, but we are actually part of dismantling culture and norms that no longer serve us, that we no longer want to perceive as normal or inevitable. And so let's talk about how we enact consent culture every day. So again, I want you to understand that people do as they are shown, not as they are told. And this is very important to understand because whether we are an athlete and we're participating in peer culture, which is, as we know, is so huge in sports, or we're an administrator or coach and we kind of oversee and help lead and create this culture, we have to understand that talking the talk and walking the talk are two different things. And in doing education work and in teaching some of these principles, I really like to use stories and anecdotes and exercises to really help embody and exemplify the meaning behind some of these things. So I'm going to borrow an exercise that an educator in BC uses when she does these talks, and I'm going to get you to join me in it. So what she has people do is picture a safe person, the most safe person you can imagine. Maybe this is a person you know. Maybe it's a fictional character. Maybe it's an identity you create with all the aspects and attributes that you would want your ideal safe person to have. So I just want you to picture that in your mind right now. All right, so let's set the stage. So the exercise is she gets her audience to imagine that you're at a party. It's very late, it's very rowdy, people are really drunk. And there's this girl there and she's intoxicated. Maybe she's starting to stumble, slur her words. It's really late and her friends have left the party. She's all alone, she's dancing, maybe she's up on a table. And she asks them, what do you think is gonna happen? Now wait, don't go there, because usually the responses she gets are, ooh, I don't know, like it's not looking too good for her. She might get sexually assaulted, right? And so she says, okay, stop, pause here. Imagine you're at the same party. It's just as late, it's just as rowdy, people are just as intoxicated. But instead of random partygoers, let's populate the whole party with clones of this safe person you imagined. What's gonna happen now? And well, all of a sudden the story changes. People are like, oh, well, you know, they'd get her a drink of water, they'd check in, maybe call her friends, see if she needed something to eat or if she wanted to sit down and rest. We'd make sure she gets a ride home or a safe place to stay. And all of a sudden, it has nothing to do with what she's drinking or doing or wearing. It has everything to do with who these people are, how they value her, and how they regard her. And this is really important in demonstrating how we need to get away from the victim blaming narrative and really put the onus on people committing these harms and perpetrating these actions. And so tying it back into the quote about people doing as they're shown and not as they're told, I like to take this story one step further. So imagine you're back at the same party and it's populated by these safe people, but then imagine there's one or two people that aren't necessarily safe. In fact, maybe we know them to be kind of shady. They've been eyeing up this girl all night, edging closer, checking her out. And I ask people, what's gonna happen now? And you know, it's kind of confusing. We don't know. We don't know what's gonna happen. I mean, we'd love to believe that any space where there are safe people that everyone's taken care of. But we can't say that for certain, because I know for myself, I think I am a safe person, and I've been a part of spaces and activities and parties where I can't say for certain without a doubt that no one was harmed in my presence. And so what I'd like to pose as an idea is that the way she is treated and the final outcomes for her in her night have everything to do with the way these safe people socially demonstrate the way they value her, regard her, and respect her. And this could happen at the party. It could be them saying hi, checking in, interacting with her in a respectful way that shows they value her. but it goes beyond that. How did these, per se, shady people or people we're not sure are safe, how did they witness and perceive you talking about her before the party? Talking about her when she wasn't in the room? How is she valued in regards to you? Do you deem her as a friend? Do you deem her valuable and respectable and contributing? And really, these are the social messaging this is the social messaging we create in our interactions, because we don't have power over another person. We can't get inside their head and see what they're thinking and tell them what to do. We can say, don't rape. We can say, don't be shady. We can say, don't take advantage of people. But the greatest influence we have over another person is demonstrating how we do expect to regard other people and treat them and value them. So really recentering our ability and our responsibility to show people how we want people to act. And then the next part about enacting consent culture is thinking about diversity and how diversity does not equal equity. And I really want to touch on this because diversity has become somewhat of a buzzword these days. Just with the current climate around social justice and anti-racism work, a lot of organizations are trying to embody this principle of diversity in their hiring processes, in their representation. And I want to talk about how diversity can be performative. If we're simply checking the box, saying, we have a Black person working for us, or an Indigenous person working for us, or a queer person working for us, that is not diversity, that is tokenism. Diversity and representation of diversity is what gets people into the room or gets them to the table. But it doesn't equate to equality. Inclusion, honoring that diversity, really valuing the contributions and what that means to your community and society and organization, valuing what they bring to the table, and giving them equal space and regard and respect and platform to be able to bring what they bring. And creating that equity is the real driver behind diversity and inclusion. And this is what we really need to get to. And we have to understand that in our sports world. I've been a part of too many teams that have a female coach, but she is not afforded the same responsibility, the same visibility as her male counterparts. I've been a part of teams where I had mostly male coaches, but there was a female coach and she was more educated. She had more coaching history and she was underpaid and sometimes unpaid, unfortunately. And so talking about what we're doing when we have diversity in their room, how are we demonstrating value of different people and different identities, and understanding that this is a daily process. And so I want you to look at who you're hiring, who you're working with, who you're representing, who are you recruiting on your teams, and why? Are there certain roadblocks and things we have to be aware of in these processes? Are there reasons that people aren't showing up or coming to the table? And are there reasons that they aren't staying at the table? And so we can think about that in what we show our athletes and how we teach them. Are we centering the contribution of women? Are we centering the contribution of people of color? In the sports highlights we show them, in the lessons we give them. And so this is kind of a process of accountability for your own self, to look around your environment and see where are the gaps. And then I just want to drive home the final point, and that is we all have more influence than we think we do. When we refer back to the rape culture pyramid, that rape culture triangle, the way we conceptualize how different aspects of society build on each other to create these norms, we understand that no matter what kind of power we have or where we show up, we have influence to positively contribute. And I want to quickly talk about the difference between power and influence. Power is something external. It comes and goes with certain titles, with certain positions. It is externally reinforced and recognized. And not everyone has equal power. We don't all have power in every situation, but we all have influence. And just think back to the people who are the most influential in your own life. Oftentimes, it's people who do not hold a lot of perceived power to the external world. Maybe it's your grandmother. Maybe it's a family member or a teacher you had back in the day. And so understanding that influence is immutable. It's something that is so long-term. It's something that has long-term effects, and it isn't contingent on the title we hold, the identity we have, or the position we're in. It has everything to do with how we're showing up in the spaces that we're in, understanding that we're interacting with people and contributing to culture daily. So I hope this feels empowering to you. I hope you have lots of questions and that you continue to think about these things as you move through the work and be open to researching and engaging in new knowledge and really broadening your scope and knowing and growing your role, however you are a part of sports culture. And so that concludes the presentation piece. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Amy, and I'd like to invite you to come to me with any questions you may have. This is a great opportunity for learning, and I think it's great if you have questions because that means you are critically engaging with this work. So let me have it.
Thank you so much. I have so many notes and just moments of like, oh yeah, like that, like so many moments. So thank you so much for taking the time to get us thinking and situating us in this. I do have one thing that if you could touch on it, I know we don't have time in the scope to really dive into it, but I'm interested if you can give some kind of tips or things to be mindful of if we experience a disclosure from someone.
Yes. Okay. How much time do we have here? This is very, very important. So here we are talking about the tertiary level of prevention. So first of all, I'll start off with believing the survivor. So what we see is the majority of survivors feel scared about coming forward or disclosing violence because of this fear of not being believed or actually being blamed for what happened to them. And so already I would like to acknowledge you that if you are that person who is receiving that disclosure, that means there is a level of trust and respect there. And I want to acknowledge you and honor you in that, and have you go forward feeling a bit secure in that. So there's this common misconception that there's a lot of false reports of sexual violence, and that's actually not the case. This is just like a fear-mongering tactic we see in the media, which blows up anytime there is a false accusation. And if you look at the statistics, like a very small percentage of people actually disclose. And of those people who disclose, a very small percentage of those are false reports. And so statistically, it's an insignificant number. So we can always believe the survivor. That is what we should do. That is what we need to do. And so going into responding. So I first want to center the understanding that there is no one way that violence manifests or is experienced. And there's so many ways that people respond to that. And so just understanding that when a survivor comes to you, it is normal to experience a bunch of conflicting emotions. And everyone presents differently, emotionally, mentally, physically. And however they present is normal and valid and okay. And we have to start really supporting that and understanding that whether they are shut down, whether they are hysterically crying, whether they're mad, the level of emotion they're showing and how they're showing it or not showing it does not pertain to the depth or severity of the harm and the violence they experienced. So really normalizing this. And then I really, really, really want to drive home this idea of making sure you are taking their lead. So when sexual violence occurs, what we're seeing is a removal of autonomy, an incidence where that person had their choice, their autonomy, and their integrity removed from them. They didn't have the power to choose and dictate what was happening to them. And so when we are responding to sexual violence, we want to create a space where the survivor is in control and really center their emotions and experiences and needs. It doesn't matter how we think about it, what we think about it, and how we feel about it. You have friends, you have a therapist, you can deal with that after. Now is the time to center them and understand that we do not want to be recreating a scenario where they do not feel power, control, and autonomy over what happens to them and what the next steps are. And sometimes this means respecting that they need space. Sometimes it's listening to them. Sometimes it's saying, would you like me to follow up once you've had some time to kind of sit with it? And maybe it's not talking about it at all. Maybe it's helping them divert their attention and do self-care activities. Really follow their lead, and also follow their lead with the language they're using around it. We don't want to be prescriptive. We don't want to start using language that labels what they've experienced, because a lot of people recognize the harm and the trauma they've experienced in retrospect, and it doesn't always register at first. That's one of the things about when your brain is traumatized. There's this protective process, and this process you go through of sorting out what happened to you. And so we do not want to start jumping to conclusions being like, you were sexually assaulted, you were raped, if they are not using that language. So really emulating and taking their lead with what they want to do, how they want to be talking about this, and what language they are using. And then also, it is never, ever our responsibility or place to investigate. I do not want people to ask, so tell me, what happened? Like, what happened? No, because no one is obligated to tell you details. And we need to ensure that people understand they don't have to tell us details to be believed. And in asking someone to share this or relive that experience, that is often deeply traumatizing and triggering and actually harmful in itself to the survivor and what they've experienced. So it's our job to lay a safety net for them and be like, I am here. Whatever you need, I will support you, and I believe you. I'm here to talk to you, but you don't have to go into detail. You don't have to tell me anything. I already believe you. And so these are just basic ways that we can begin centering the survivor, centering what they've experienced, really making it about them and what they need. And one thing I want you to know is that when you show up with compassion and with belief for them, when you respond in these empathetic and appropriate ways, that actually has really great long-term effects. So the way someone is first received and responded to when they disclose sexual violence often dictates their openness to continue receiving support and resources, and kind of their long-term mental and emotional outcomes. And so just in doing these simple steps, you might not feel like you're fixing the problem or doing much, but I can guarantee you, you're having a positive effect on the survivor's experience after trauma has occurred.
Thank you for that. I made notes about, I think, the autonomy and just like that sense of showing up and just creating space is so important in almost all situations where we connect with someone who is in a major emotional state. So I really appreciate that. We have some audience questions. So
All right.
I think we have 3, so we'll kind of work through them. The first question is, how do we help to bring awareness to the idea that rape and sexual assault often happens by people the victim knows, and not always from a stranger in a mask jumping out of the bushes?
Yes, thank you for bringing this up. That's actually a very common misconception. And it is prevalent in a lot of the social messaging we receive, like don't walk alone at night, don't talk to strangers. You know, we've been saying this to kids since they were very, very small. And the reality is, if we look at the statistics, the vast majority of sexual violence is perpetrated by someone the survivor knows. This is a statistic. And Sometimes it's people they're related to. Sometimes it's family, friends, people they have been sharing spaces with or have known or known of for years. And also the idea that it might be a man just like jumping out of the bushes, like, no, like we have to denormalize this, because really what we're seeing there is the distancing ourselves from the problem by suggesting that it is someone who is not like us or who is obviously harmful. We're able to distance ourselves from the everyday reality that we walk around with a lot of these people every day without realizing it. And so this isn't to instill great fear in you. This is to understand that when we are perpetuating this rhetoric, we're actually contributing to a lot of the harmful myths and social messaging that aren't helping survivors, aren't holding the right people accountable. So I think it's really important to talk about this openly. Anytime you witness or hear someone perpetuating a myth, you'd be like, I know where you're coming from, but I have this different understanding. I learned this statistic. I want to share something interesting with you, and kind of approaching things with the lens of sharing and learning and engaging each other in this healthy dialogue and conversation, because that can take the shame out of it. There's always a little shame and fear about being wrong, about saying something poorly. So anytime we call someone in and kind of go through that learning process with them, we're doing a great service, not only for them, but anyone they interact with.
Yes, and I think I wait for the moment where television changes and we're no longer, projecting that, man jumping out of the bushes in almost every TV show. So
For sure. We definitely need that. It'll
um,
have to be a separate presentation.
so other than calling people out in the moment, is there some practical work or resources and activities that people could do with younger athletes to help make them aware of their complicity with the bottom level of the rape culture triangle?
I think this begins with how we are actually interacting with those athletes and having them understand their own value. Because until we've really centered what our own value is, it's hard to really fully embody and understand and honor other people's value, right? And so the messaging about what is valued in society is so inherent in what we are taught and socialized to value about ourselves. And so whether you're dealing with male athletes or female athletes, what attributes and values and characteristics they demonstrate and you positively respond to or negatively respond to is going to share a message with them about what is acceptable, what is expected of them, what is a valued part of their identity and disposition, and what isn't. And so I believe that before we talk about it directly, we have to start modeling that with them in our interactions and showing how we value and regard them. Because what people hold shame around and can't confront in their own selves and can't fully embody without fear in their own selves is something they will have a problem with being open to and valuing and regarding in another person. And we know this about so many aspects of our lives. Like, we are prone to judging people based on the things we judge ourselves most harshly and critically of. And this might be conscious and it might be subconscious. So understanding that this is the place where these values begin to be integrated and normalized and embodied is where we have to begin. And then as we move forward, starting to be more open and direct about communicating that. If you see your athlete breaking down or having a moment of intense emotion, starting to normalize that, deeming it as something healthy and actually valuable that they are able to experience this broad range of human emotions. Having a place to be soft and gentle when we really value aggression and dominance and strength. Having the space to be thoughtful. Listening to diverse voices and sharing resources and people and ideas with them that don't come from the same identities and people that they identify with or think they are. Showing that there is so much knowledge and value out there beyond themselves and that doesn't take away from their own value. And so, especially with younger children or people who are growing up within these norms and cultures, it's so important that we begin modeling and talking about this in a very, very open way so that they can begin to grow with this mindfulness and awareness.
Yes. Oh, I think about having worked with young males and how delicate this idea of creating shame over emotions is. And it's so important that we're modeling these, this openness, this vulnerability, and just kind of this love for ourselves so they can do the same. We are at the 11 o'clock time, but we have a couple more questions. So if you're okay, we'll work through those.
Let's take them all. People can stay as long as they like or leave if they have other obligations, but thank you for being here this long. I really appreciate it.
Okay. So question is, how do we advocate for better policies around office sexual harassment, as many policies are outdated?
Yes, this is a huge issue. Luckily, we're kind of getting into the times where a lot of the challenges and stuff we're facing around sexual violence are becoming more openly talked about. And I think it's really healthy to create this dialogue. And it's hard for me to answer this question directly because it kind of all depends on your position within that organization, what power you have, what resources and connections you have to start facilitating these conversations and this change. But I would again like to center that we do have influence. And so maybe this is something you start talking with your coworkers about. Maybe you are part of different spaces or organizations that can advocate for this or on your behalf. And I think it's really important to use our spheres of influence and our networks. And one of the beautiful things about starting to talk about these things openly and really confront the challenges and the gaps and inadequacies we face is that there may be a lot of other people thinking the exact same thing as you, and you just haven't talked about it yet. So I've been really lucky in my work with the Sexual Violence Office at UBC, and in kind of socially being known as someone who talks about this. I've had people come to me and had further opportunities to delve into this work, further opportunities and connections that have opened to me and given me more power to make change and pursue change. And it all began with me socially messaging and demonstrating that I did care about this topic, that I did want to make change. And there's something about modeling that outward that allows the right people and opportunities to come to you. So it is hard for me to answer your question directly. I hope there are resources within your given organization that you can start talking about these things. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of policy changes coming up and a lot of dialogue around these things, especially with the anti-racism movement going on. It's a time, especially during COVID, that organizations are making a lot of internal changes. So if you feel compelled to have these conversations, if you feel compelled to step up to the plate and kind of bring up this topic around change, I think now is the time to do it and feel very valid and empowered in doing so, because this is not just going to change things for you and your experience with the organization, but with the people they work with and the way they model things outwardly to the rest of society.
Ah, that's fantastic. And I admire the courage that you have to be able to step up and say, like, this matters to me, and this matters, and we need to talk about it. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it does take courage to step up and say, hey, let's have this conversation. So
it's always worth it though.
yes. Last question here kind of actually ties into the last one, and I'm going to tack a little bit onto the question, but it says, how can we encourage coaches to value and respond to sexual assault and create both a champion and consent culture? And then I'll also tack on is maybe if you have some resources or, social media accounts or those things that we can kind of follow so that we're getting all the resources.
Ooh, okay. This is a great question. So we're talking about how do we get coaches, let me understand this. We're talking about how do we get coaches to respond appropriately and recognize sexual violence?
And just to truly value the need to create this consent culture.
Okay. First of all, have them come to my talk. Why aren't they here? Yes, okay, so it's very important to understand that sexual violence is not a topic in and of itself that we do on the side. It is very central to our everyday language, our everyday interaction. Unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of great educational resources around this. We're still in the process of building and promoting them. So hopefully we'll have more soon. But unfortunately, with coaching, it's such kind of like a niche career. We often put a lot of value on someone's individual knowledge of a specific game, and not so much on the leadership components and the responsibility in nurturing athletes, in nurturing and promoting the individual, in creating culture and norms. And so obviously this depends on like what your relationship is to the coach. Do we know if this is an athlete asking this question or
No,
a staff member?
you don't know.
Okay, that's fine. So what I did with my coaches is just start having these hard conversations with them, and having them understand that this is something, sexual violence is so normalized and happens so frequently right now, because depending on their identity and whether they're masculine and how they're navigating the space, they might not experience it as much or realize that it's quite as much of an issue as it is. And I do not say that in the sense that males do not experience sexual violence. They do. They do. But if you're asking me, like, how do we have them respond to this and validate it and understand that it's a big problem, I'm assuming they don't already know that. So just having these conversations and really ask them, like, what are your resources? Like, are you part of an organization or governing body that kind of develops resources around this? Like, is this a conversation you can bring to your next coaches meeting or department meeting? And really kind of putting some responsibility on them about saying, hey, like, I am bringing this need to you, knowing that you have power and an authority. What can you do for me? What can you contribute to this conversation, knowing that this is a need? And there's something really brilliant about students and athletes asking authorities to step up to the plate and asking for that. They actually have more pull than you might think, because coaches' jobs, administrators' jobs, department level jobs are all there to serve the athlete, to promote the sport, to ensure that we have all the tools and knowledges and resources to do the best we can. So it is actually in their job description to interact and bring resources and support to whatever it is you need to have the maximum impact and potential and excellence, right? So understanding that and not feeling guilty about bringing them into that conversation or feeling like you're asking too much or asking extra of them. Consent culture, peer culture, sports culture, this is all part of their responsibility and job description. And so just start having the conversation. Ask them what they can do for you. And if they don't know, that's a great way to jump off into the conversation and be like, well, why don't you find out and then report back to me?
And I'll just follow up and say it was actually another coach that asked, and they're passionate about getting other coaches to care, and just kind of that idea of like teaching young males like to fully understand consent culture and just really to live that. So
Amazing. Yes, you should do that.
yes. Thank you so much. This was fantastic, and I really hope that, you know, once this goes online, people share it, we watch it. I think it's such an important topic that everybody needs to know about, because it's something we all live every single day. So let's spread the message. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this so much, and I hope everyone took something from it.
And thank you to everybody for watching. I see still some people that stayed on for the whole time. A reminder that we do have another talk this afternoon. I am so excited about this panel of health practitioners. We're going to dive into kind of their experiences And if you've never spent time talking to an athletic therapist or a physiotherapist, I highly recommend that you join. Their role is so impactful on our athletes, and they do so much that I think so many people don't understand. So I'm really excited to highlight that. But thank you, Shiayli, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day.